So first, I will be answering the question of why heating and lighting is important for reptile wellness and well-being. Then we'll be going over the basics of heating and then the basics of lighting. And then there's kind of like a merger in between where they kind of merge together. And then I'll have a do's and don't sections just for like the most obvious and common mistakes, some that I've made in the past when keeping reptiles. And then I'm going to try to give you as many resources as possible so that you can find information for your specific reptile species that you keep. So I just want to give a little bit of a disclaimer. I am really, really passionate about this, and I will base everything I say off of empirical sources and give citations, but I am not yet an expert and I'm not a vet. So I also want to say that this presentation isn't meant to shame anyone. So if you see something that I say, don't do this, and you are doing that, don't panic. We all have to start somewhere. So getting better information is the first step in improving your husbandry. And then I'm also trying my best to make everything here as accessible as possible. I'm a PhD student, so sometimes when I'm talking, I don't realize that the words I'm using aren't commonly used by everyone. So if you don't understand what I'm talking about, feel free to interrupt me and let me know, hey, I don't get what you're talking about. All right, so let's get started with reptile wellness. So in relation to light, there are three key components of reptile wellness. So there's thermoregulation, their ability to change their temperature through access to hot and cool zones, circadian rhythm, or knowing when it's time to be awake and when it's time to sleep, and then physiological, and by that I mean skin, organs, brain. Mostly this is about getting the proper vitamins, and yes, I promise it has to do with light. So first, you probably already know this, but reptiles are ectotherms, which just means they get their heat from their environment. Humans and other mammals are endotherms, so we maintain our own body heat. But reptiles can't shiver or sweat. So instead, if they get too cold, they bask in the sun or find hot pavement. If they get too hot, they find some shade or bury themselves underground. In the wild, this is easy for reptiles to do. But in captivity in our homes, they can only access what we give them. So if we don't give them a proper basking spot, they might not be able to get warm enough to do things like digest their food. So I'm using Onyx and his enclosure as an example. So you can see him basking in his basking zone, which I labeled in red. It is very, very hot up there. It is like 95 degrees most of the day. Sometimes it gets up to 100, just depending on how hot it is outside. In yellow, there's like a cooler zone that's still pretty warm, which stays around 85 to 90 degrees during the day. And then his cool zone, he actually has a couple different ones, but the main one is under that log, and it's about 75 to 80 degrees. So anytime Onyx gets too hot, he can travel to different parts of his enclosure to cool down. If he just ate, he usually hangs out in his basking spot for most of the day, to be honest, because he's always eating. So in order to make sure that you are setting like good temperatures for your reptiles, you need to be able to check the temperature in your reptiles' enclosures. So for basking spots, the best thing I think is one of these like laser temperature guns. This is the exact one I have. I bought it on Amazon. It's not expensive. It's not fancy. It works fine. It just shows you the temperature of like the surface. So if you have like a rock or a log or something, you can see what the temperature that they are laying on. And then there's ambient temperature or just the general temperature of the air. So this will need to be done with some type of temperature probe. I'm going to be talking about this later in heating, but basically, I'm going to talk about how objects that produce heat should be attached to a thermostat. Most thermostats will also show you the current temperature in the enclosure. So you can also just use those as like a temperature gauge. And then I also have these really fancy Govee temperature. It has like an app. You put them in there. It has an app. You can like make settings to where it can like notify me, so I can get a notification if the temperature gets too hot in my crested geckos enclosure, which is like really helpful because they're really sensitive to getting too hot. Which is why she's not out here in my hot living room and she's in a bedroom with an AC unit. So yeah, I can get text messages anytime, like letting me know that her cage is getting too hot. So that's an option as well. So you'll notice in a previous slide that I mentioned, onyx's temperature is such and such during the day. That's because light and heat have a huge impact on the circadian rhythm of an animal. So there's diurnal animals that are mostly awake during the day, like bearded dragons. There's nocturnal animals that are the opposite. They're up all night, like a crested gecko. And then the other option is crepuscular. This is something that not everyone knows about, but these guys are awake at two different times of day. So early morning and usually in the evening. And a lot of times these animals will be living in hot desert areas where like the middle of the day is not a good time to be awake and out and about. Or some of them eat insects. And if you know anything about bugs, they're out in the morning and they're out in the evening. So they're taking advantage of that. So how do they know when to exhibit different behaviors? They don't have alarm clocks. So they look for changes in light and heat to figure out what time of day it is. And so they can do this by the photoperiod, which is the duration of daylight during a 24-hour period. So during the summer, this might be 12 to 14 hours, depending on where you are on in the globe. But in the winter, it's going to go down to 8 or 9 hours. But then they also have like a internal built-in circadian rhythm, which can like override actual light and heat. This also happens in humans. So people that wake up at 7 a.m., no matter what time of year or how much light there is, I can't relate to that, but I know people who are like that. So that's a really strong built-in circadian rhythm, and some species have stronger built-in rhythms than other species. So how can you recreate this circadian rhythm at home? So to be very simple, you can just turn the lights off at night before you go to bed. That requires two things. It requires you to be home at the same time every day, and also remembering to do that, which sometimes, you might forget. The easiest, most people use timers. So these are some of the ones that I currently use. So they're like really simple ones, like the one on the left just handles a few plugs. I use the strip in the middle a lot. It has a side where it's timed and a side where it's not timed. And then there's like the fancy Govee ones. This is a brand that I recommend so often. I should be sponsored by, but they're smart plugs. And so you can set them up to come on during certain times of the day or off at other times of the day. So there's pros and cons to each one of these methods. So obviously the smart timers need the internet. So if you don't have stable Wi-Fi, that's not going to be a good option. And then I also wanted to mention what is called a night drop. So reptiles should have a night drop. When the sun goes down, the temperature does go down, even if it's just a little bit for like desert species. And so many reptiles actually don't require any heat at night, and your house temperature should be just fine. But you'll want to check to make sure that your species doesn't have like really specific requirements at night. And then finally, physiology. So many of you who keep diurnal reptiles have probably heard of metabolic bone disease. This is a disease an animal can get if they don't get enough vitamin D in their diet. Vitamin D is important for calcium absorption and therefore the growth of bones. So they have a lot of like growth problems in their bones. And you can and you should supplement with vitamin D, but the best way for them to absorb that is from UVB from the sun. So every species is designed to collect a certain amount of UVB. And just like us getting sunburns in the summer, they can get too much. So it's important to understand the species specific needs of your reptile. And I'll talk more about this later and give you resources to help you figure that out. So just like with thermoregulation, reptiles need to be able to regulate how much UVB they're getting by moving around their enclosure. So using onyx as an example, again, in the red area, he gets the most UVB. In the yellow, it gets lower. And then in the blue area, he receives no UVB at all. And so the level of UVB in your enclosure is going to depend on a few things. So how strong your bulb is, how close the animal can get to the bulb, how large the enclosure is, his basking spot is set up really high because it's a tall enclosure. And it's set up that way so that he can get close to the UV bulb and get appropriate levels of UV. Okay, and so that's it for section 1. I know I threw a ton of information at you like right off the bat, so I'll pause for a moment to see if anybody has any questions. And take a sip of water.
It looks like Kay has a question. What is it called? The Gobi switches that hook up to your phone?
Oh yeah, so the temperature probes, if you go to, it's GOVEE. Actually, I can actually go back and get you a better look at that. These are this in the picture, I bought them on Amazon. They also have them from the Govi website. And you can get them in packs of like 3 or 6. It has like the top thing is a kind of like a Wi-Fi. I don't know. I'm not a tech person. Basically, you plug that thing in and then all the probes connect to that thing, which connects to your Wi-Fi. And then there's an app and you can give them names. You can set up certain parameters. So like I have, for him, I worry about him getting too cold in the winter. So if his cage gets too cold, it'll send me an alert. And then for my crested gecko, I worry about her getting too hot. So I have it set up for her where if it gets over a certain temperature, it'll send me a text and say, hey, your enclosure is too hot. So yeah, I can find a link to these specific ones and I can send that to you like at the end if you want, if that's helpful.
I have a question.
Yes.
Yeah, I have a leopard gecko, and for some reason, I must have read early on that the UV lights were bad for them. I can't remember why, so I never used one.
Yeah.
Maybe is it bad for their eyesight or something? Or
So that was kind of, I think that's more of a myth. And well, it's not a myth that UVB can be bad for their eyesight. Like I said, like they can get too much. I think part of the reason that most people who keep leopard geckos don't use UV is because most leopard geckos are kept in very like short, shallow enclosures, which can make using UV light unsafe in that circumstance because the distance from the bulb is too short, or they don't have enough places to get away from the UV during the day. I use UV for my leopard gecko. It's a very low output bulb. And he has a slightly taller enclosure than I think some people use. But he has like 3 different hides. I have plants in there. He can get away from it. And he mostly just hides all day. But I'll get into this more in when I talk more thoroughly about UV. But there are ways that you can figure out like if it is safe for your reptile. But unless they're like, there are certain leopard gecko morphs that should not have UV. So there's certain ones that are like all white or like albino. They've been shown to have some issues with UV because of the mutations that they have.
okay, thank you.
Yeah, of course. All right. I'm gonna go
There
back
was
to,
one more question in the chat.
okay.
What about issues with beardies rearranging their entire enclosure?
Yeah, so I have had that problem before. I totally understand. It's completely built in for that reason because he would just push stuff around. I think probably the best way if you have a bearded dragon that's like constantly moving his basking spot to the wrong part is to kind of do like a more of a zone method. So like the left part of the cage has a higher UVB than the middle part of the cage, so that way, no matter how tall or like where he pushes things around, the level of UVB he's getting is based on where he is in the cage instead of what he's sitting on, if that makes sense, if that's helpful.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Alrighty. So I'm gonna move on, but there'll be other opportunities too. I just don't want to run out of time. So now, is it going to switch? All right. So for the next two sections on heating and lighting, I'm going to be breaking down this chart from a 2025 paper called A New Age of Lighting and Heating for Reptile Husbandry. And don't get overwhelmed. We're gonna go step by step through it. So I'm gonna start off with near infrared wavelengths of light. So these are invisible wavelengths that have extremely important functions for your reptile. So primarily, I highlighted them. Thermoregulation and circadian rhythm are the biggest ones. There's like multiple on the list that kind of go along with that. And the first important one is called IR or infrared A. And this is what most of us consider like the heat from the sun, because you feel it pretty strongly. And it also corresponds with sunlight. This name in particular, IRA, is important. And I would remember that just because you're going to want to look for it on heating bulbs that you buy for your animal. The next type is what's called FIR. The name isn't important. Basically, this is just heat that was trapped by a rock or the pavement or a log or whatever, and then it gets re-emitted later. So you're probably already using this somewhere in your enclosure. And then the best way to get near infrared wavelengths for your reptile is by using a tungsten or halogen bulb. And I'm going to use a graph to show you why. So this is from the same paper. And on this graph, infrared A is in the third column, and it corresponds with sunlight, like I said. So it should be on during the day and off at night. And then in blue is the tungsten basking lamp, and that gives the highest amount of IRA, whereas something like a ceramic heat emitter and heat panels or heat mats produce 0% IRA. And that's not to say that ceramic heat emitters and heat panels aren't good tools. They have great uses for increasing ambient air temperature, especially at night because they don't produce light. But they should not be used for basking because they do not produce any IRA. So as far as I know, the only bulb type on the market that I know of that produces IRA but not visible light is a deep heat projector. This one is from Arcadia Reptile, but most of the time, bulbs that produce IRA also produce visible light, and they'll usually look like this. So this is where heating and lighting start to merge, because now we're going to be talking about visible light that corresponds to heating that's happening in your enclosure as well. So this is a bulb from Arcadia that does both visible light and IRA. It's a halogen. This is another brand that I highly recommend. I'm not sponsored by them, but they're not the only brand that I think produces good bulbs. What I like about them is they give like good information on the box, and they make it really accessible to understand what you're buying. So that's pretty much why I like them the most. But you can also use standard halogens that you can find at the hardware store. So any halogen floodlight, like at Home Depot, as long as it's not an LED, it will produce IRA. But they can be more difficult to find now. I know like California has outlawed halogen lights. You can only have LEDs now, so they're getting more difficult to find, unfortunately. So from a heating point of view, the next wavelengths that I'm going to be talking about, the visible light wavelengths, it's primarily the wavelengths that heat the surface of the skin. So it's really important for the shedding for the reptile and fighting off bacterial and fungal infections. And then when we start talking about lighting, visible light is necessary for vision. So even nocturnal animals use the minimal amount of light that's reflected off of the moon to see. And so many reptiles use physical or postural communication, like bearded dragons will like wave their arms or bob their heads or whatever. And they need to be able to see each other to do that. So they do that during the day when there's a lot of light. And then, of course, circadian rhythm is another obvious one. So it's daytime when the sun is out and it's bright, and when it's not, it's nighttime. And then there was just a note that I wanted to put in here about the parietal eye, because I think it's cool. A parietal eye is an ancient form of an eye that can detect light and shadow. Bearded dragons have a parietal eye right on the top of their head. And so the function of this is to alert them to a flying predator overhead. And so they can know to hide without even having to look up. Um, the link on here talks all about it. I think it's really cool. But I won't go into a tangent about it. It is neat though. All right, so I'm gonna stop here, like halfway through this chart, to see if anybody had any questions about near infrared wavelengths or like visible light. And if not, I can keep moving on. Take a sip of my water. All good? Okay. I'm gonna take a sip of my water and then I'll continue. All right, so now we're going from heating / lighting to lighting itself. And we're going to be talking about UV wavelengths. So ultraviolet light doesn't necessarily produce heat. And this chart has this like really short list, which makes it seem like it's not important. But it's extremely important. And it's also a really complex discussion, which is why it got its own section. Basically, these wavelengths are not visible to humans, but many birds and some reptiles can see UVA. And so UVA, you might recognize that name as the one that causes cancer, and that's absolutely true. And too much UVA can also hurt reptiles in the same way that it can hurt us. But primarily the biggest and most important part of UV light is how it helps reptiles produce calcium through vitamin D with UVB. And so I mentioned before that oops, I did not mean to switch yet. As I mentioned before, each species like collects a certain amount and they have like a zone that they are in. And so I'm going to explain the different zones and what that means. So the Ferguson zones are based off of an experiment done by Ferguson. I used this table from a newer paper because I felt like it explained it really well. But they're basically the guidelines of how much UVB an animal needs based on values that they took in the field. So essentially the researchers followed around animals and watched their behavior and movements and then took measurements of the UVB in that area called an ultraviolet index or a UVI. And then they divided them into 4 zones. If I were to lay under a reptile light that produces UVA, would I get cancer? Yes. And I'll talk about that at the end. That's a good point. So for each zone, there is a range of UVI. So because animals move in and out of UV like they do heat. And then there's a maximum UVI, which was the maximum they saw an animal in that group use. And so that is the assumed limit for what is safe for that species. And so you might be looking at this chart and see the phrase thermal conformer and thinking, Kellee, you just told me that reptiles were thermoregulators. And yes, that's true. Thermal conformers are thermoregulators, but they're a little bit different. So they are not active thermoregulators. They don't bask in the sun. They just kind of depend on their environment to be the temperature that they need. And they're also usually more sensitive to temperature changes. So thermal conformers are usually crepuscular or nocturnal. So like a crested gecko or even a leopard gecko is a good example of that. Okay, so there are different types of fixtures that allow you to give UVB access to your reptiles, and they all have different appropriate uses. So this paper went over, I mean, this is like the Bible of UV lighting when it comes to reptiles. It went over all the different fixtures, different brands. I based so much of this part of the PowerPoint off this paper, so it's a great resource. The first one is a T8 UVB fluorescent tube. You've probably seen this in pet stores. Reptisuns are really popular. It has like this wide, straight coverage area and produces a relatively low level of UVI. So the different colors represent the UVI or the UV index, and then the numbers represent a distance in centimeters. So at 30 centimeters for A, you're looking at a UVI of 0.5 for this fluorescent tube. And then the second one is a mercury vapor lamp. So this one looks more like a standard light bulb, and it emits a very different shape of UVI. And then if you compare them, you can see that the mercury vapor bulb has a much higher UVI than the T8 at like the same distance. So at 20 centimeters from the bulb for the T8, you're only getting 0.5 to 1 UVI, whereas for the mercury vapor bulb, you're getting between 6 and 8. So that's why this is important to know what type of bulb that you should get and what type of fixture to use. So there's a spider crawling across my desk. Interesting. Okay. All right. So here's two more options. These lamps, these produce so much UVI that I could barely fit them on the slide. So the first one is a T5HO fluorescent tube. HO just means high output, as in lots of UV. So similar to the T8, it has a long straight coverage area. And just the difference is that this produces a ton more UV. So at a closer distance, you're getting like 6 to 8 as opposed to 0.5 to 1. And then the last one is a metal halide lamp. So it's kind of similar to a mercury vapor bulb, but it has a much smaller beam of UV light that's very intense. So T5 and metal halide lamps should be used with caution because of their high output. So you have to make sure that you measure the distance from the basking spot to the bulb to make sure they're getting the right amount of UV and not too much UV. I personally don't suggest using a metal halide unless you have a UVI meter because there's such a high risk of burns for that intensity of UV. So besides the fixtures and the tools, there's different ways that you can set up your enclosure to get the appropriate UV for your animal. So this paper talked about the shade method and the sunbeam method. So that's kind of what I was talking about earlier with setting up a bearded dragon's enclosure a little bit differently. So the shade method uses low amounts of UV over like most of the enclosure. And then the varying levels are controlled by how close the animal is to the lamp. So that's what I did at Onyx's cage. Whereas the sunbeam method uses high amounts of UV in like one area. That's their basking zone. And you can have a little bit of a gradient, but this really requires that you have another area of the cage that does not have any UV at all, or like a complete shade for them to hide under. So here's that full image. It's kind of overwhelming, but this paper has great infographics. I'll be including all of the infographics I use at the end in like a full size. But so this shows for zones 1 and 2. The best option is the shade method. It gives the ranges of UV and some different species options. Excuse me. And also like what type of bulb is probably best for these species. So it's a great tool. And then this paper also looked at a bunch of different brands because unfortunately UVB bulbs are not standardized. Each brand has differences. And so this isn't to say that one is better than another. It's just, it depends on your species, the enclosure, how it's set up. And so they tested a bunch of different brands. This is just a sample. I'll give you the full at the end of the PowerPoint. But what's most important is that the animal is fully covered by the appropriate amount of UVB when they want to be. So they have access to it, but they can also get away from it. And then my last point was previously brought up. If you are putting your hands in your enclosure that has UV light, turn it off because we are so much more sensitive to UV lighting than our reptiles are. And you could get burned by your UV light. You can get skin cancer from your bulbs. So these are kind of dangerous bulbs to be working with for, pathetic mammals like ourselves. They're really made for reptiles. So just be really careful with them when they're on. All right. So any questions about UV lighting?
There was a question which you answered already, which was that if you
Yeah.
were to lay under a reptile light that produces UVA, would I get cancer? You just said yeah.
Yes. Yeah, that could be bad. I would imagine you'd probably get sunburn first, but yeah, it can be bad for you. We don't have scales, so unfortunately, we're a little bit weak in comparison to reptiles when it comes to UV lighting.
Another question, could you elaborate on the need for UVA a little more?
Yeah, so let me go back to where I talk about eye. So UVA is kind of grouped into this wavelength. UVB is the most important for like D3 synthesis, but UVA has implications with their immune system, different types of signaling. So some reptiles can see UVA and use UVA as a means of visual communication. Also egg development and things like that. From what I've seen, there's not a ton of research about what reptiles get from UVA. It's a lot of guessing. Really what we know is more about UVB. So that's stuff that, you know, I would like to kind of investigate that if I could. I don't have the time at the moment, but that's something that I think really needs to be looked into. Yeah,
Another
exactly.
question?
We mostly just hear about UVB. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think UVB is a must-have for all snakes?
So I know that there's a lot of like snake keepers that say that, you know, snakes don't need UVB. And I understand where that's coming from. Again, a lot of times snakes are kept in enclosures where it might not be appropriate to use UVB. But I think if you can give a reptile access to UVB, you should. Like if cost is not an issue, if you have the ability to do so, if it's safe to do so in their enclosure, I always think it's a good idea because it allows them to make a choice. It gives them options that they would have in the wild, but they might not have in captivity if you don't give them that opportunity. Personally, don't use it, but I do see that there can be a benefit. Yeah, and I think for some species that where metabolic bone disease is not really a concern, it is kind of a personal option. And also like you said, it might be expensive. So what is your financial ability? And also just like the enclosure too. So like before I had my snake in this oversized, really massive enclosure. I didn't use UVB for her because it wouldn't be appropriate in the enclosure that she was in, and she might have gotten burned by it. But now that she's in this huge enclosure, I'm able to give her UVB because now it's safe. And I can't afford it either. But I spend my money on my reptiles. That's basically where it all goes. Yes.
Uh, can you tell me whether or not you have a link to this paper that you quoted?
So I can, if you send me an email or if you give me your email, I can send you a PDF of the paper if you would like to read the entire thing.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Want that link too? Okay, yeah, I can maybe I can give the PDFs to Rebecca and then she can forward them to the people that want them since she has all of our information at her fingertips. But yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So, as an alternative
Mhm.
to the UVB lighting, regarding like a leopard gecko, do you have
Mhm.
these powdered supplements that have calcium and vitamin
Mhm.
D?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on those?
Oh, I think they're great. I think everybody should be, supplementing as well, just to make sure that they're getting all the nutritional requirements that they need. And especially if they're not getting UVB because they can't make it on their own, they should be getting vitamin D. I still supplement vitamin D for Onyx, even though he sits under his basking light all day in the UVB. I still give him a supplement periodically just to cover my bases. For him, it would not be appropriate to depend on the vitamin D, but for a leopard gecko, it might be based on, your enclosure, your animal, your preferences. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, of course. Okay. Yes, I made like a PDF of this whole slideshow. So you'll not only have like all of the images on the slideshow, but you'll also have all of my rambly notes that you can look at. All right, so in the interest of time, I'm going to keep going. All right, quick do's and don'ts. We covered most of these with questions, but just a reminder, I'm not an expert. I just read a lot and I'm a nerd. And if you're doing something that I say, don't do it. Please don't like feel like I'm shaming you. This is for informational purposes only. In my opinion, the best keepers do the best with the information that they have. And so the point of this is to give you more information. So first of all, you want to provide hot and cool zones. You don't want to make the entire enclosure hot, even if it's a desert species. Second, you want to turn visible and UV lights off at night. If you leave them on, you're going to mess up your animal's circadian rhythm. They're not going to be very happy. They're going to be grumpy. They're trying to sleep and the lights are on. You're going to want to let your temps drop a little bit at night. Keeping it hot all night can also kind of mess up their circadian rhythm. It can trigger like really weird breeding responses in some animals because their breeding season is signified by a hot night period. So you don't want to keep it super hot all night. Next, you want to provide IRA, visible light, and UV light to reptiles. So don't depend on heat mats or heat emitters for heat because they don't provide IRA, which they really, really need to help them like digest their food and the other things that we talked about. One of my do's is to provide UVB for all reptiles. Caveat, if it makes sense, right? Don't depend on vitamin D supplements, especially for animals like bearded dragons, where, UVB is not optional. You got to have it. And then if you're going to use UVB, you want to ensure proper UVI. So if you're placing your UV lamp over a mesh screen, you might actually have to get a higher level lamp than what you would typically need because mesh and glass block UV light. And so you can get that information from most brands on like, if you're putting it over a mesh screen, what should you do to make sure you're getting proper UVI. You can also get a UVI meter called a solar meter, but they're really expensive. They are like prohibitively expensive. They cost around $300. So that's not something that everyone's going to have, which is why like measuring and using these brands' information is really important. And so this is probably the most important point in my entire presentation. If you only remember one thing about this presentation, is that please use a thermostat of some type for all heat sources. These heat lamps get so incredibly hot. They can be a fire hazard. They can overheat your cage. I have heard horror stories. I don't even want to talk about it. Using a thermostat, I think, is like paramount to animal husbandry and also your safety. So there's different types. There's on-off thermostats. There's dimming thermostats. The one in the middle is like the top of the line expensive one, but most people can't afford that. So the one on the left, which is an on-off that I bought on Amazon, it works great. The one on the right is a dimming thermostat that's connected to a lamp. I also bought it on Amazon and it also works great. The difference is that an on-off thermostat, like you set a threshold and if it gets to a certain temperature, it'll turn the lamp off. Whereas the dimming one will dim the bulb to try to keep a specific temperature. Okay. If I want to eventually use UVB for my leopard gecko, but for now I'm depending on supplements. Yes, that's great. Thermostats, yes. You use the left one, it's cheap and it still works. Yeah, the left one, I think I have like 10 of those in my house right now because I am a stickler for this rule. Every heat thing is attached to a thermostat. I have dimming thermostats in the basking spots to make sure that they stay at the right temperature. But for like my auxiliary heating sources, like the ones I use in the winter to make sure like his cage doesn't get too cold, those are just on-offs. They work fantastic. So any more questions about my quick little do and don't situation before we go into resources? The Herpstat the best, but they are pricey. That is like my dream thermostat. That is the thermostat I dream about as a reptile husbandry enthusiast, and I hope to one day be able to afford one for my crew. That time is not now. They really are amazing technology, but I wish they didn't have like a monopoly over this technology so that it could be more cost effective for the rest of us. Okay, so some resources. I want to try to give you guys as many resources as possible. So the first one, the most accessible, I think, for everybody is Facebook groups. So there are some really great Facebook groups. The one that I absolutely love is Advancing Herpetological Husbandry. They have guides that walk you through all of these different things that I've talked about, among other husbandry related things. And then they also have a sister group called Reptile Lighting. And that's basically, I got so much of my information from Reptile Lighting. It's an excellent group. There are other reptile related groups on Facebook. You just want to be careful. So the pros of Facebook groups is that it's extremely accessible and you can interact with other keepers, maybe make friends. But the cons is that sometimes the other keepers are not very nice. People can get very passionate and very harsh about things. There also might be some Facebook groups that have incorrect or outdated sources and suggestions. So make sure that they are citing their sources and you know where they're getting their information and that these are all like, this is all recent information that they have. Okay. The next great resource for this topic is Arcadia Reptile. Again, I would love if they sponsored me, but they don't. So they are a reptile husbandry brand, but they are also the leader in reptile lighting research. So they have a handy interactive UV index guide right on their website. And then through this lighting guide, you can bring up suggestions and instructions for specific reptile species, and they have so many in their database. If you're keeping a species that doesn't come up, they request that you send it to them so that they can add it. So on this example, I put in bearded dragon and it came right up and I clicked it. And it gives you product recommendations based on your enclosure type. It gives different recommendations of different fixtures, different bulbs, and it gives them from their personal catalog because, again, they're a brand. But it makes it kind of easy. So there are some cons to Arcadia Reptile, unfortunately. They're a UK-based company, so their products do tend to be a little bit more expensive because of like tariffs and everything. Sometimes they can be difficult to find. It's gotten easier to find Arcadia Reptile lighting, but I still haven't found a website that carries everything. But that being said, if price is not an obstacle or you're like me and you just spend all your money on your reptiles anyway, I really think Arcadia Reptile is kind of the top of the line when it comes to lighting and heating. So other brands will often have blogs and information as well. So ZoomEd has a blog. They also have this great like graphic on their website to help you figure out which bulbs to buy, and it has like an education page. Pangea Reptile has a blog where they talk about husbandry things. Josh's Frogs has an information blog, and also the Bio Dude. So again, I'm not sponsored by any of these brands, but I've used them all before. I think they're pretty good. The con of using a brand for information is that ultimately their main purpose is to sell you a product. But if you love ZoomEd and it's easily accessible for you, it is nice to get a lot of your information from them because then they can kind of steer you towards which part of their line will be best for your reptile. So it's really just about like doing your due diligence and ensuring their sources are good and maybe reading that paper that I'm going to send out that has all of these brands to help you like decide which ones are best for you. And then the last resource, but unfortunately, maybe the least accessible resource is the literature. And by that, I mean peer-reviewed scientific literature. So this information has undergone a process that's taken months and many, many people to ensure that the information is correct. But it's not perfect, you know. It reduces the risk of error, basically. So many journals are turning to open access, but one resource that anyone can use is called ResearchGate. It's a platform that allows researchers to post their own articles. They sometimes will post summaries or they will post the full thing, which is great. And it gives you the opportunity to email them directly if you have questions or if you need the full article from them in PDF form. I have sent messages to researchers on ResearchGate about their articles, and they're usually thrilled to send you the PDF because they want everyone to read it. So obviously, this is all great pros to ResearchGate and reading the literature, but scientific articles can be really difficult to read if you're not used to reading them. The jargon, the writing style, the organization can be really tricky and overwhelming. So groups like Advancing Herpetological Husbandry, who break down sources into guides, are really important. And I have some things in the chat. Yeah, so ZoomEd, like I said, like when you're looking at a brand, sometimes they're going to sell you something over what's actually good. So checking something like the literature or a Facebook group for information alongside their information can be really helpful when making decisions. And then you can also ask your local PhD student questions about literature and research papers, because we are constantly reading these scientific articles and we've gotten pretty good at it. And so on that note of being a PhD student, I asked for permission from the Herp Club to ask for your help with my research. So grant funding for science is at an all-time low right now. Reptile-related research is some of the worst funded in general. And so it's extremely difficult, if not impossible, to get grants at the moment, and many labs are losing funding. So what I'm doing with Phelsuma geckos is completely novel. It's behavioral training that's never been done before with a squamate reptile, which is super cool, really exciting. I'm thrilled by it. But it also means that the grants are really cautious about funding it, and they prefer to see some type of preliminary result. Unfortunately, getting preliminary results also costs money. So I'm very lucky in that my lab has so much technology, really like grand sound chambers, recording equipment. And so basically all that's left for me to do is figure out how to get the geckos themselves and to get husbandry supplies for them. So I've started crowdfunding for husbandry supplies to get preliminary results in my pilot study. And so I have a Ko-fi, which is like a crowdfunding website, if you would like to check it out. If you don't want to donate money, you can also just follow me, because I'll be like posting like updates as my research continues. But also, if you have husbandry supplies, if you've kept an animal in the past or you've changed your setup and you have like supplies like heat lamps or old bulbs or anything like that that's just like gathering dust in your garage, I would love it. You can feel free to email me and let me know. I'm happy to come pick it up, take it off your hands, and then those husbandry supplies will get used by me for scientific research. So thank you so much for listening to me ramble and nerd out about heating and lighting for reptiles. I had so much fun putting this PowerPoint together. And I've talked with Rebecca and the Herp Club about doing a series. So if you liked my PowerPoint, if you want me to cover more topics in the future, I'm happy to do that. Just let me know or let Rebecca know if there are any topics that you would like me to look at. And so, yeah, the PowerPoint, the recording, it's all going to be available to you. And then we will send out PDFs of any papers that you guys would like to see.